I was recently talking to my father about the Orthodox veneration of the Theotokos. And he was very uncomfortable with the hymns, the various songs that seemed to praise her. And looking back on that conversation, I think the disconnect between my father and I comes around the use of the term worship. In Pentecostalism, of which my dad is a member, worship is singing songs and feeling particular emotions as you sing songs. You're not truly worshiping until you're surrendering to God through song, standing next to others who are doing the same thing. That's corporate worship. That's not worship in Orthodoxy. That's one aspect of worship, is singing songs, singing hymns and songs. Psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. That's what the scriptures talk about. But singing songs is not at the heart of worship. What's at the heart of worship is sacrifice. And what are we adoring in liturgy? We're adoring the offering up of God, by God, to God. Christ offers himself on behalf of all and for all. He is the one who offers. He's the priest who offers. He is the offering, and he's the one to whom the offering is given. And we adore, we worship what God is doing in Christ. And so it's a bit of a category error to say, using worship the way that Orthodox people use the term worship. It's a category error to say that Orthodox people worship Mary. It's not possible. It's not possible because Mary derives her value from that offering. She does offer herself to God. And so in that, there's praise for what she's done in imitation of who Christ would be, or in a foreshadowing of the human nature that Christ would adopt. But the value she has is entirely contingent on Christ, on God. And so no matter how much one praises Mary, one cannot fall into the worship of Mary unless Mary becomes the reason for her own veneration. If what you're worshiping in a saint is that saint himself, and not the glory of God shining through the saint, then that's idolatry. But all the saints, Mary at the foremost, they all point beyond themselves, up the mountain to God. And so you praise them because of how they adore God. And you live in imitation of them. And in imitating the saints, you draw near to the throne of grace. And so, once again, to say it again, it's a category error to conflate veneration and worship. Maybe one way to describe the difference would be to take something that we're all familiar with, a modern day religion like sports. People worship sports, or particular sports even. They worship competition, the cult of youth, whatever you want to say. They worship the power of these players to embody the virtues of particular to the sport. So take as an example football. People worship football, and they have particular teams that they're devoted to. But they're devoted to those teams because those teams are participating in football. And they might have particular players that they venerate on those teams who are participating in football. But the football is the source of the value that those players have. Disconnected from that game, those teams and those players, they have no value in themselves. And so one can venerate a football player who is exemplifying the virtues involved in the game of football, but one can't worship that player unless one turns one's attention away from football and becomes enamored by the person themselves and begins to see that person as their everything. At that point, once that person becomes the sole judge of good and bad in that person, that's the point at which, in the person who's adoring, that's the point at which one has moved from veneration to worship. In Orthodoxy, if that were to happen, if a saint were to become the sole judge of good and bad in a person, in an Orthodox faithful, that would be, I mean, it's almost inconceivable that that would be the case, because Christ is the sole judge of good and bad. He's the standard by which all the saints are measured. And they're not measured on their own merits. Merit doesn't even come into it. That's a Latin concept. That's a Western concept. They're measured based on the amount of grace that they've participated in, which is represented by the halo, the disk of God's presence around their head. It's not their glory that's shining. It's God's glory in them. And so I go back to the difference between worship and praise. Everyone would acknowledge, who's a fan of anything outside of the faith, of any other value system, that it's insane to think that you're not allowed to venerate people who exemplify the virtues associated with that which you value. That's why we have halls of fame. Like, this impulse in us to venerate those who exemplify what we value is just hardwired. And so if it's not being exercised in our faith, because it's somehow off limits, it'll get exercised outside of our faith, and it will support the fracturing, the bifurcating of our field of attention, such that we're not 100% committed to the virtues and the values and the grace issuing from the throne of God. Instead, we have other virtues and values that are mixed in, because these things need to be expressed, our need for veneration. And it's disingenuous to say that anybody doesn't venerate someone. It's just very strange that the one place there wouldn't be veneration would be in relation to that which is the highest of all, those who participate most fully in the divine energies of God, the grace of God. And so, to reiterate, worship is placing your attention on what is the highest. Veneration is acknowledging that which most embodies, and praising that which most embodies and most images, most reflects that value, that glory. And so none of these saints they only derive their value from Christ. And the street doesn't go both ways. And every Christian who's venerating any saint intuitively knows this. That saint would be valueless unless their life was hid in Christ, with Christ and God.